The cold air bit his cheeks as he climbed onto the steel catwalk of his B-17 flying fortress. It was still night. A thin crust of frost clung to the bomber's skin like winter paint about to melt. The engines hadn't fired yet, but the scent of oil, leather, and adrenaline already hung in the air. Lieutenant James Harrison, just 23 and fresh from flight school, tightened his gloves and stared down the runway. Behind him, a line of massive bombers stretched as far as he could see. Row after row of four-engine giants. Quiet now, but not for long. Somewhere in the German countryside, factories churned out tanks, aircraft, and shells. That was the target. That was why he was there. But he couldn't shake what he'd heard the night before. A rumor, half whisper, half gallows humor, moving through the airfield barracks. "They say the German generals mock us," one navigator said, pulling his wool blanket closer. "Mock?" Harrison asked. "Yeah, they think we're mad to fly these lumbering beasts in daylight." "They call us slow targets with wings," someone else added. "They call the B-17 a steel coffin." Harrison had seen worse. His squadron had lost 4 planes just last week. He'd watched one of them spiral into the freezing North Sea, the crew bailing out into the dark water. None survived. But today felt different. He checked his watch. 0500 hours. In less than half an hour, more than 2,000 American bombers would climb together. Not 200, not 500, 2,000 B-17s and B-24s, backed by hundreds of long-range P-51s. T-1 Mustangs. The mission was called Operation Overwhelm. It was set to be the largest daylight raid in history, and somewhere beyond the horizon, German commanders were still smirking. They wouldn't be for long. At the height of World War II in 1943, Germany controlled almost all of continental Europe. Its war machine ran on a vast industrial network. Factories in Hamburg, refineries in Ploiești, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. Everything depended on steel, fuel, and gears. American strategists believed that destroying Germany's industrial core could shorten the war by years. But to do that, they had to fly deep into enemy skies, straight into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. Their chosen tool was the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was enormous. 4 engines, a dozen or more machine gun positions, and tens of thousands of rivets holding it together. It could reach altitudes above 20,000 feet, haul up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, and take punishment other planes couldn't survive. There was one problem. The United States insisted on daylight precision bombing. The British, after suffering horrendous losses early on, had switched to night raids, darkness offering cover. The Americans rejected that approach. They trusted technology, formation flying, and the defensive firepower of the fortress. They believed they could force a path through German air defenses without the cloak of night. The Germans thought that was folly. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, men like Hermann Göring and General Adolf Galland read intelligence on the American raids. At first they scoffed. To them, the idea of lumbering bombers crossing the sky defended only by their gunners was almost comic. Göring reportedly smirked. "If even one enemy bomber reaches the Ruhr, you may call me Meyer." For a while, their confidence seemed justified. Early attacks, like the raid on Regensburg in August 1943, were bloodbaths. Dozens of fortresses burned. Gunners watched helplessly as Messerschmitts tore apart neighboring aircraft. In some assaults, as many as 1 in 5 bombers never returned. But the Americans didn't stop. They adapted, they honed tighter formations, overlapping fields of fire, and better radio coordination. They brought in long-range escorts, the P-47s and eventually the P-51 Mustangs, to protect the bombers deeper into enemy airspace. Back home, factories from Seattle to Detroit accelerated production, churning out more planes, more bombs, and more young crews. And they planned something audacious, something so vast it would erase the sneer on every face in Berlin. They called it Operation Overwhelm. The making of Operation Overwhelm began in a frigid planning room within Allied headquarters in England. The idea was simple and terrifying. Not hundreds of bombers, but thousands. Not a single wing, but waves. An endless, sky-blackening tide of steel and thunder descending on Nazi industry. It was American scale. Across the United States, production climbed to a roar. Hour by hour, B-17s rolled off the assembly lines. Minute by minute, workers, many of them women, riveted the war machine together. Detroit didn't just build cars anymore. It built flying fortresses. By early 1944, more than 12,000 B-17s had been produced. Thousands of P-51 Mustangs stood ready for escort duty, equipped with drop tanks that could carry them to Berlin and back. Fuel was stockpiled. Ammunition was loaded. The stage was set. Flight paths were charted with precision measured in seconds. And then came the pilots. Boys, really. Some were just 19 farm kids from Iowa, factory hands from Pennsylvania, fresh-faced cadetses from California. Many had never flown over water until crossing the Atlantic, and now they were being asked to fly into the belly of the beast. For Lieutenant James Harrison, it felt like a fever dream. The night before the mission, he sat in the briefing hall, surrounded by rows of nervous, silent men. The officer at the front clicked on a projector and pointed to the map. Tomorrow, we're sending the largest bombing force in human history, over 2,000 heavy bombers, multiple wings, multiple targets, German industrial centers, rail yards, oil depots. We hit them all at once. A low murmur ran through the room. Make no mistake, the officer continued. This is not just a mission. This is a message. By the early morning hours of March 3, 1944, crews across dozens of airfields began to prepare. The cold bit at their fingers as they loaded bomb racks and checked gun mounts. Waist gunners kissed lucky coins. Co-pilots adjusted oxygen masks. Engines groaned to life one by one until the air trembled. As Harrison climbed into the cockpit, he took one last look around. The horizon to his left was lined with silhouettes, hundreds of B-17s. To his right, more overhead, the red streaks of navigation lights danced in the darkness. He tapped his pilot's shoulder and said quietly, "We're not flying a mission. We're flying a wall." And that wall was about to move. Lift off. The sky turns to steel. 600 hours. One by one, the propellers roared awake, sending icy mist swirling off the airfield tarmac like ghost smoke. The cold morning light glinted off the aluminum fuselages, catching along the frames of over 2,000 bombers. Each one looked like a silver shark with wings, sleek, brutal, and ready to strike. Lieutenant Harrison felt the vibration in his boots before he saw anything. Then came the movement. Taxi lines of bombers rolled forward slowly at first, wheels crunching on frozen ground, then gaining rhythm like soldiers marching into history. The noise was deafening. Not a scream, not a hum, but a deep bone-rattling rumble. 300 horsepower per engine. 4 engines per plane. Over 8,000 engines churned the air at once. Even inside the cockpit with the canopy shut, it felt like thunder lived in his chest. "Twer, this is Hellcat 79er, ready for takeoff," his pilot called in. "Copy that, 79er," the voice crackled back, clear to roll. "Godspeed." The throttle pushed forward, and the world began to move fast. Harrison gripped the edge of the frame as the runway whipped beneath them, white lines flashing by. The bomber shook. Then it rose, the wheels tucked under. Gravity loosened its grip, and just like that, they were airborne. Then came the view. As they climbed to altitude, Harrison turned his head and looked out the side window. What he saw stole his breath. From horizon to horizon, the sky was filled with aircraft. B-17s, B-24s, all flying in tight combat box formations above them, below them, beside them. Each plane separated by only yards, layers stacked like shelves of metal, 3, 4, 5 tiers high. It was not a formation. It was an armada, a floating city of war machines drifting across the clouds, blinking red and green with navigation lights. A flying fortress, but not one plane. Thousands. The sun broke the clouds behind them and hit the wings just right, casting reflections like a field of knives. It wasn't beautiful, it was overwhelming. They reached 25,000 FT, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped below freezing. Frost crept across the inside of the glass. Oxygen masks hissed with each breath. In the tail gunner's position, Private Sullivan muttered into his intercom, "I feel like I'm flying inside a refrigerator full of bullets." Ahead, the mission map showed multiple targets. Munich, Leipzig, Nuremberg. The idea was simple. Overwhelm German defenses, split their fighter response, saturate the sky so wide and thick, no single unit could hold the line. But in command, bunkers across Germany, Theradar operators were already sounding alarms. One officer in Cologne stared at his screen and said, "My God, it's not a raid. It's an invasion. God, it's not a raid. It's an invasion." Luftwaffe command scrambled. Orders were shouted. Fighters scrambled from dozens of airfields. Anti-aircraft crews took position along the German industrial belt. Ammunition belts were dragged out and slammed into place. Yet even now, many German generals still didn't believe it. They'd seen 300 planes before, maybe 500 on a bold day. But this had to be a trick, a radar glitch, some kind of phantom fleet. But it wasn't. Harrison's squadron kept position, each plane locked into its place like gears in a great mechanical beast. Gunner crews scanned the horizon. Flak jackets tightened. Fingers hovered over triggers. In his headset, the lead navigator's voice came calmly. "Hold steady. We'll be crossing the border in 7 minutes." And then, as if drawn from the edge of the earth, the German sky began to shift. Black dots, fast, aggressive, emerged ahead. Fighters, hundreds, into the storm. They came like wolves, silent, fast, and lethal. The first German fighters appeared at extreme range, black dots against a pale blue sky. Then they closed the distance with terrifying speed, sunlight flashing off their wings. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf-1 or 9s, sleek and clawing through the air, dove straight at the leading squadrons. "Bandits 12 were high." The voice in Harrison's headset snapped like a whip. Gunners swung into action. The ball turret below him began to spin, and the tail gun started barking. Then the sky erupted. Tracers lit up the cold morning air like red lightning. Flashes exploded across the formation as 50-caliber rounds poured from every direction. The first Messerschmitt tore through the top layer of bombers and veered off, smoke trailing behind it. Another screamed in from the right, loosing 20mm cannon fire that shredded through a B-17's wing 3 FT from the fuel tank. "Number 3 is hit!" someone shouted. "She's dropping out." Harrison turned and saw it. A bomber with its right engine, a flame, peeling off in a slow spiral. Tiny black dots. Crew members leapt from the fuselage, parachutes unfurling too low, too late. More fighters followed. Waves 5 at a time. 10, 20. Like hornets, they darted in, fired, and fled before the gun scud pinned them down. Inside the cockpit, the temperature dropped even lower as the oxygen system strained to keep up. Every breath burned his lungs like dry ice. Frost clung to the dials. His gloves stuck to the yoke. Below, the German countryside crept into view. Frozen forests, train lines, and the gray skeletons of cities battered by 2 years of war. But Harrison barely saw it. He was watching the skies. To his left, another squadron of B-24 Liberators merged into formation. 30, 40 of them flying wing to wing. One had a nose art that read Lucky Devil, with a red horned figure grinning beneath the cockpit. Just as he noticed it, flak opened up. Thick black clouds bloomed in the sky ahead, each one the size of a car, flung up by German anti-aircraft batteries hidden on the ground. They burst without warning, sharp flat cracks that rattled the bomber like hailstones on a tin roof. The formation tightened. each bomber flying just feet from the next. Any sudden move and they'd collide. "Hold formation," barked the command channel. "Do not break," Harrison gritted his teeth. It was like driving through a thunderstorm made of steel. Explosions rocked the air. Smoke poured across the windscreen. The nose of their bomber lifted slightly, just enough to avoid a shattered plane falling from above. Below him, the radio operator screamed, "Tail gunner's hit! He's bleeding out!" There was no time to help. Outside, a German fighter tried a head-on pass. Its machine guns lit up and vanished in an instant, vaporized by 4 converging gun crews that turned the enemy fighter into flying scrap. Still, they kept coming. In the command bunker outside Berlin, Luftwaffe officers stared at the radar reports in disbelief. There weren't hundreds of bombers in the air. There were thousands. The machines they'd laughed at were now darkening the sky. One colonel stood frozen, muttering the same line over and over. It's not possible. But it was, and it was only getting started. The bombing run. Fire from the sky. 25,000 FT above Germany. The cold was so sharp it could crack your skin. Oxygen hissed through rubber tubes. The inside of Harrison's mask was damp with frozen breath. Every metal surface in the plane felt like it could rip the flesh from his fingers. But he didn't feel the cold anymore. He was locked in. Ahead, the call came through the intercom. 2 minutes to bomb run. This was it. The moment when every single bomber in the formation would open its bay doors and unleash tens of thousands of pounds of destruction. Bombs meant not just to break buildings, but to shatter Germany's capacity to wage war. But before that moment came the gauntlet. The flak intensified. It wasn't random anymore. It was calculated. German gunners on the ground had dialed in their range and were now walking the shells across the sky like a hunter chasing prey. Boom! A black blossom burst dead ahead, and the shock waves slapped their bomber like a giant hand. The nose dipped. Alarms screamed. They corrected altitude by instinct barely. To their left, a B-17 caught a direct hit. One of the wings disintegrated in midair. No parachutes, just a falling arc of flame. Harrison didn't even flinch. His brain had locked that kind of horror behind a thick mental wall, one he couldn't afford to break open. "Not yet. Bomb bay doors open," came the call from the bombardier. With a low mechanical groan, the plane's belly opened wide, exposing the payload. 500 lb bombs, suspended like pendulums, swaying slightly as the plane rocked in the turbulence. Below, the target came into view, a sprawling railroad on the outskirts of Leipzig. Rows of train cars loaded with fuel, warehouses, machine shops, steel plants, every piece of infrastructure feeding the Nazi war machine. "Steady, steady," the bombardier whispered. The bombs had to fall exactly where they were needed. Even a few seconds too early and innocent civilians would die. Too late, and the military targets would survive. Outside the bomber, the sky was chaos. Tracer fire stitched through the clouds like red thread. Smoke trails hung in the air like old ghosts. Fighters still circled like sharks. But now the bombers were too deep, too many. The German defenses had been outflanked, confused by the sheer number of formations, by the sheer force of the American push. Then finally, bombs away. The release was almost gentle, a sudden lurch upward as the weight dropped free. Harrison didn't see the bombs fall, he felt it. The plane climbed slightly as the payload dropped away, the burden suddenly gone, and then a rumble below, then a second, then a third. Outside he saw it, massive fireballs rising from the ground, black smoke twisting into the sky in great boiling columns. Entire blocks were engulfed. Steel roofs peeled back like paper. Train cars snapped in half, their wheels flying. Ammunition depot cooked off with chain reactions that sent shock waves all the way to 25,000 Fahreft. Behind them, other bombers released in perfect unison. A synchronized cascade of destruction across miles of sky. It wasn't just a bombing raid, it was a sky-wide fist slamming down on the Reich. In bunkers beneath Leipzig, German soldiers screamed and scrambled. In factories, assembly lines stopped mid-motion. Workers dropped to the floor as walls shook and dust poured from the ceilings. Even the Luftwaffe generals watching from remote command posts fell into stunned silence. This was no surgical strike. This was brute force on an industrial scale, American scale, and they weren't done yet. The retreat holding the line in the inferno. They dropped the bombs, but the mission was far from over. As the formation banked westward to begin the long journey back to England, Harrison caught a glimpse of the destruction below. Whole blocks of Leipzig were consumed in fire and smoke, rising like black rivers toward the upper atmosphere. Trains lay mangled on their sides, the steel tracks beneath them twisted like string. He couldn't feel proud. Not yet. His hands trembled on the edge of the window frame. His knees locked tight to keep from shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, and what replaced it wasn't relief. It was dread, because now came the return leg, and the Germans were waiting. Even as the bomb bay doors slammed shut beneath him, a voice crackled through the intercom. Enemy fighters, 6 twinks. The Luftwaffe was not done. Focke-Wulf 190s had circled wide during the bombing run, waiting for the moment when the bombers were vulnerable, when formations were looser and guns were distracted. Now they pounced. 4 came in low, straight at Harrison's group. Machine guns flashed. Cannon fire zipped past the tail. One round struck the left elevator, jolting the bomber. Another slammed into the side armor, inches from the waist gunner's chest. Private Sullivan screamed into the mic. "I'm hit! I'm hit! Arm's gone cold. Can't feel my arm." Blood pooled around his gun mount, but he stayed upright, firing with his good hand, trying to keep the fighters at bay. More enemy aircraft appeared in the upper right quadrant. Then more, dozens. They weren't just fighting for airspace now. They were fighting for revenge. From the front of the plane, the co-pilot shouted, "WWII, brace!" A Messerschmitt dove in, guns blazing, clipped the edge of another B-17, and disintegrated in mid-air, its flaming wings spiraling into a second bomber that exploded instantly in a ball of light. No parachutes, no time. The formation scattered for a moment. Chaos. But then came the voice of their group commander over the open radio. "This is Colonel Jeff. Hold the line. Tighten formation. Keep moving. If we break now, we don't make it." And so they did. Harrison could barely believe it. But they held under fire, wounded, limping with engines damaged and control surfaces shredded. They held formation. The same geometry of steel and muscle that had carried them into battle now became their only chance of getting out alive. Then, like a miracle, the sound changed. The roar of enemy fire began to fade. New engines joined the chorus. Familiar, comforting. Long-range escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs, fast and beautiful, soared into view, diving on the German attackers with righteous fury. One peeled down from the sun and cut a Messerschmitt in half with a single burst. The tide turned. The Germans scattered. The formation reformed. The bombers, bloodied but unbroken, pointed their noses back toward England. Inside the fuselage, oxygen was low, ammunition was nearly gone. A half-dozen of the gunners were wounded, but they were alive. Harrison looked over at his pilot, who said nothing, just nodded slowly as if to say, "We made it through the worst, but we're not the same." And he was right. Return to base, silence, smoke, and the weight of survival. The English coast came into view just after 1400 hours. It looked like salvation. Green fields, thin lines of hedge, the pale shimmer of the channel below. After hours of wind, flak, and fire, the calm of England's shores felt surreal, like stepping out of a hurricane and onto a photograph. But for the men inside the bombers, the calm didn't reach them. They were shaking, covered in blood. Sometimes their own, sometimes someone else's. Oxygen masks were stiff with frost. Flight suits were soaked with sweat and engine grease. Some gunners had gone completely silent, staring, numb. In Harrison's plane, the radio operator was slumped against the wall. Not dead, not alive either, just hollow. A man who'd spoken jokes that morning now didn't respond to his own name. When the B-17 wheels finally touched the wet tarmac at RAF Thorley, the jolt almost buckled the landing gear. The brakes screamed, the engines sputtered, one completely dead. They rolled to a stop amid a line of returning aircraft, some missing entire wings, tails held together with wire and prayer. On the ground, medics ran forward. Trucks and stretchers waited. Amajor climbed into the cockpit and asked, "How many back?" The pilot didn't speak. He just pointed to the sky and then held up 3 fingers. 3 lost from their group in one mission. That was considered good. Lieutenant Harrison stepped down the ladder and touched the ground like it wasn't real. He turned around and looked at his plane, his home for the last 9 hours. It had holes punched clean through the tail, scorch marks along the fuselage, and one engine coughing out black smoke. And yet, it had brought him home. All across the airfield, men climbed out of ruined machines, limping, carrying wounded, helping each other stand. Some collapsed. Some kissed the earth. Some stood tall, but with thousandy stares that wouldn't go away. The debriefing room was silent. Commanders read casualty reports aloud. It sounded like a roll call in reverse. Some squadrons had lost 10%, others none. But the shock wasn't in who didn't come back. It was in what they'd seen, the scale of destruction, the violence from the ground, the way a whole sky had caught fire and stayed burning. Then came the numbers. 2,000 bombers had taken part, nearly 200 enemy fighters downed, 5 major industrial targets destroyed, thousands of tons of bombs dropped. And though losses were painful, the majority had returned. It worked. Operation Overwhelm worked. Across the channel in Berlin, a different kind of silence fell. German officers stared at recon photos showing whole neighborhoods reduced to ashes. Trains derailed, ball-bearing plants gone, ammunition stockpiles vanished. All in one day, all from one wave. General Gehland, one of Germany's top Luftwaffe commanders, muttered to his aide, "This is not bombing. This is erasure." And perhaps more terrifying than the bombs was the realization that the Americans could do it again and again and again. When the laughing stops that night, the barracks were quiet. No cheering, no toasts, no victory songs. The men were too tired, too bruised, too gutted by what they'd seen and what they'd done. Some stared at walls, others sat with heads and hands. One man, Private Sullivan, the waist gunner, who took a round to the arm, refused morphine. Just kept whispering, "Did we get the target? Did it matter?" Lieutenant Harrison sat on the edge of his bunk, boots still on, uniform soaked in dried sweat and grime. Across the room, someone coughed, deep, dry, mechanical, the sound of lungs filled with burnt cordite. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor. The mission had succeeded militarily, tactically, even logistically. But what haunted the men wasn't just the fire and flak. It was the moment they realized they were no longer battling soldiers. They were confronting a nation's war machine. Factories, laborers, supply lines, and engines of war don't bleed, but they can break. In the days that followed, reconnaissance photos confirmed what the air crews already sensed. Operation Overwhelm had shattered German production capacity across vast regions. Leipzig's rail yard was nothing but a crater. Fuel depots near Nuremberg burned for days on end. Steel output in Halle plummeted by over 70% within 2 weeks. For the first time, the Nazi war machine began to falter. Fighter assembly slowed. Tank components were delayed. Munition trains failed to arrive. And most crucial of all, morale inside Germany, once insulated from the full force of Allied might, began to fracture. The German High Command, once so certain of its air dominance, now faced an impossible equation. Even if they destroyed 200 bombers a day, America could replace them with 300 more. Even if they trained new pilots, they could never keep pace with the flood. The United States had transformed its entire industrial strength into a relentless engine of retribution. And the generals, the same men who once mocked the lumbering American bombers, now studied their maps with trembling hands. Field Marshal Erhard Milch was said to have torn up the day's reports and slammed his fist against the table. "There are too many," he growled. "We can't shoot down a wall." By the spring of 1944, Germany had redeployed hundreds of fighters and flak batteries from the Eastern Front and from France to protect its own cities, weakening its hold over the rest of Europe. That decision would prove fatal, because only months later, those exposed flanks became the breach through which the Allies stormed Normandy. Operation Overwhelm wasn't just another bombing mission. It was a turning point. It forced the Reich to look skyward and understand that the heavens no longer belonged to them. And for the Americans, it became proof that courage, precision, and unrelenting scale could do more than strike a blow. They could rewrite the course of history. Years later, James Harrison stood inside a museum hangar in Dayton, Ohio. Before him rested the scarred shell of a B-17 in flying fortress, restored, polished, silent. A plaque beside it read, "Sentinel of the Skies, 1942-1945. He gazed at the metal for a long while. He could still smell the oil, leather, sweat, and cordite. He could still feel the sting of frost on his fingertips. He could still hear the roar of engines and the sharp crack of gunfire. But most of all, he remembered the silence that followed. The moment they landed, when men walked off their planes with blood in their boots and tears in their eyes. The war was over. The Reich had fallen. And men like him, boys when it began, returned as something different, older, heavier, quieter. He rarely spoke about it. But when asked what he remembered most, he never mentioned the bombs, the fire, or even the enemy. He always said the same thing. "I remember looking out the window and seeing nothing but wings, wings stretching from one end of the sky to the other. And I thought, if we can do this, maybe we can do anything." Operation Overwhelm wasn't only the largest daylight raid in history. It was the moment when American industry, invention, and resolve turned the tide of a war once thought unwinnable. It was the day the sky became steel, and Germany, for the first time, felt true fear. For the Luftwaffe, it marked the end of laughter. For the world, it marked the beginning of change. And for the men who flew that day, it became the defining chapter of their lives. Some returned home. Some never did. But all of them carried the same memory. A sky so crowded with bombers, it seemed as if the earth itself had risen to fight. It seemed as if the earth itself had risen to fight.